this question of, we know that the right way to be is an individual who has control over themselves so they can be healthy and, be fiscally sound. Again, that is something that we've decided on, not very consciously, but it makes people who don't do those things completely deviant. As long as it kept you with other people, like you were doing your dependency or your compulsion together, or it allowed you to be with people, that was addiction and it was positive. The issue was whether you were alone or with others. That was the distinction between addiction and vice.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
What is it about dependence that bothers so many of us? It seems like here in the U.S. we've been deeply conditioned to each stand as islands of self-reliance, never needing anyone else, never having human moments of imperfection. Our self-worth is so often tied to our output, and more specifically, how much of that output we can generate without any input from others. We are solely responsible for our health, our habits, our careers, our status, our success, and ultimately our outcomes. Under hypercapitalism, when one of us is too young or too old to stand on our own, we then become a societal burden, a problem to be addressed by everyone else. Having been conditioned to gauge our self-worth based on output, we can begin to feel as if we are less for relying on someone, or that it is a mistake or sign of weakness to do so. When it comes to our habits, we're supposed to only have those that are productive, ones that don't create any dependence. Drugs are increasingly marketed for not carrying a risk of dependence. And any substance that does result in dependence is quickly vilified and banned, and the public is warned against taking it. I'm Ferguson, and you're listening to Narcotica. We are a listener-supported show and greatly appreciate those of you who help to keep the show going. Troy and I have busy lives, but we want to take every chance we can to keep producing episodes and providing y'all with clear signal about drugs and the people who use them. If you enjoy the show and you'd like to support it, you can do that financially via Patreon, info in the show notes. Otherwise, you can leave a good review, which significantly helps boost Narcotica on media outlets. Today, we're bringing you a discussion with Liz Roberts. Liz is a professor of anthropology at the University of Michigan and the author of In Praise of Addiction, or How We Can Learn to Love Dependency in a Damaged World and God's Laboratory. Since 2013, she has participated in collaborative environmental health research in Mexico City. We are honored to continue to have the chance to bring you the scoop on drugs and the people who use them. And now we give you a conversation with Liz Roberts. We're speaking with Elizabeth Roberts. Joining me as well as my co-host, who you know, Troy Farah.
Hey, how's it going?
Thanks so much for joining us today, Liz.
It's great to be here.
Can we give folks a little bit of an idea of how you come to this topic and how you become interested in it and started to write on it and everything?
Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist. I'm actually a medical anthropologist. And about 15 years ago, I started working with environmental health researchers in Mexico City. And I was really interested in understanding how they and their research subjects in Mexico City understood what exposure is. And I spent a year living in very tightly knit working class communities in Mexico City, neighborhoods, to kind of understand that question, like what is exposure for people? And people started using the word addiction in kind of weird ways. Like they kept telling me they were addicted to lead, and I didn't know what that meant. It seemed strange to say that you're addicted to a toxic substance that we know causes harm in all these ways. And so I was trying to understand more about that. And then I realized that my neighbors, including my landladies and landlords who I was living with, were actually teaching me something or showing me something about addiction that I just hadn't gone looking for, but was really different than what I knew from the United States. And I'm going to tell you what that difference was, but over time, as I started learning more about what they were saying, and what they were sharing with me, I realized that they had a lot to teach me about my own experience of addiction that I was bringing with me from the United States, especially in relation to my own family, my sister, who was an alcoholic, and my own relationship to binge eating and not being able to be in control of food, and all the other addictions that so many people in my family had. So that ended up feeling like a powerful thing. And what the book is about, In Praise of Addiction, is half of it, or a little less than half, is about these neighborhoods in Mexico City. And a big chunk of it is about my family, especially myself and my sister, and my using what I learned in Mexico City to actually come to a really different understanding of her relationship to both alcohol and prescription medications like benzodiazepines. And then a third of the book, or a little less, is kind of this cultural historical criticism of our definition and understanding of addiction, and trying to kind of push for a different approach to thinking about addiction. So I can tell you now about what they taught me in Mexico. Should I do that?
Sure, I would love that. And by the way, folks, if you haven't picked up the book, you should. And this interview should in no means be a stand-in for actually reading the book. Please let us know, what was it that you picked up?
So what I learned was that people parsed compulsion, or not being in control of something, or being dependent on something, in two different ways in these neighborhoods. And that addiction for them, for my neighbors, was any kind of compulsion or dependency, something they had no control over, that connected them with other people. So it could be anything. It could be alcohol. It could be drugs. It could be, you're going to laugh, maybe selling Tupperware. It could be plastic ponies. It could just anything that you didn't have control over and you had this, what I call a devotional relationship to. As long as it kept you with other people, like you were doing your dependency or your compulsion together, or it allowed you to be with people, that was addiction, and it was positive. And then vice was something that compulsively swept you away, but unlike addiction, it took you away from other people. It isolated you. And that also could be anything. It could be that, for someone could have an addiction, and it could be a booze. And for another person, booze would make them isolate themselves. So then it became a vice. That was a vice. And the issue for my neighbors wasn't whether the compulsion was harmful to your health, or, you might die sooner, or you were, intoxicated or not in control of yourself. The issue was whether you were alone or with others. That was the distinction between addiction and vice. And they didn't judge anyone for either of them. Like most people assumed at some point in your life, you're going to have a vice that takes you away from people. And then hopefully you'll replace it. And you'll replace it with an addiction, and it'll bring you back to being around other people. So, and they just didn't isolate people for anything. What happened was sometimes people isolated themselves in vice. And that, again, was confusing to people. Like, why are you doing this? But they never cast anyone out for their addiction or their vice. And the problem that people saw was, what can we do to bring people who are in vice back to being with us? The problem wasn't this person is drunk or messed up. It's how can we get them to be with us? And that felt incredibly different than what I knew from the United States, where I grew up in a white working middle class world, where, for instance, I and members of my family had isolated my sister for years for drinking. But also, even when she stopped drinking, many people shamed her or isolated her for using prescription medications, which were the things that actually helped her stay with us, with people. But the fact that she was dependent on those medications is really deeply upsetting to people, because any form of dependency in the United States, where we are supposed to be rugged individuals, is a deeply disturbing thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wonder if you could expand on that, because with my own experience, I have been diagnosed with all these different substance use disorders, and I've been forced into treatment by the courts and spent months of my life in and out of the criminal legal system. as a result of the way that my behavior has been being framed, both legally and socially and psychologically. But the times that I've struggled the most have not necessarily been the times when I was using the most drugs, but more likely the times when I was the most isolated, the times when I felt like there was just no one there. So how do you kind of like, how do you map this onto like this expectation around dependence? Like why is it so bad to have a dependence in American culture?
Yeah, so I guess, well, there's so much in what you just said, and thank you for saying that. And it resonates so much with what I've seen with my sister, but I even know for myself in terms of, like, I would say one of the most problem things that I've struggled with the most in my life is food. And these days, now that I've kind of spent all these years thinking about it, I look back on it and think like the struggle was the fact that I thought I needed to be in control of my relationship to food. And I would isolate myself because I was embarrassed about my relationship with food. People didn't isolate me so much as they do with people who are more obviously intoxicated, I think often. But again, it's that like spin cycle of isolation and shame that seems to be so just potent and isolating and harmful. So I think we do need to talk about history here. One of the things I do in the book is take readers through the way that the word addiction, when it first moved into the English language from Latin, meant almost its exact opposite. It had some of the same meaning, but it had this really positive valence. It basically meant devotion. It meant when you often willingly gave yourself over, when someone gave themselves over to something that then swept them away in ways that they were no longer in control of. And that could be alcohol, definitely, especially if it was connective. So there's this book, Addiction and Devotion in Early Modern England by Rebecca Lemon that I got a lot of this history from. And she talks about how military regiments of young men, these young men would engage in orgiastic communal drinking and brawling. And that was called an addiction because it was for the regiment and for the greater good of the king, but it was this like collective, almost like, bacchanalian sort of experience. Another way that addiction was used was to talk about biblical scholarship, which might not sound that fun compared to a lot of drinking if you're not a scholar. But if you're a scholar like me, or a painter even, or someone who gets swept away by something like that, I think, we can relate. Like some kind of activity that takes you away and you feel like you're in this exalted state. And I see guitars behind you in the room. Like maybe for you, Aaron, playing guitar could feel something like you have this ecstatic devotional relationship to it. And maybe people are saying like, come back to us, stop playing guitar. Or maybe you play guitar with a whole bunch of people and you are in the stratosphere in all these ways. That is the way that addiction got talked about. Also romantic love. And there's some really interesting histories about romantic love. And so addiction, and there's all these writings by these biblical translators where these translators would say, you should be addict onto Christ's worship. So that's pretty different than the way we talk about addiction now. And then you get a few hundred years pass, right? And you have the rise of all of these things, including capitalism, which is pretty good at helping us find things that excite us, like, substances and activities and behaviors that get us going. But also that capitalism is connected to kind of new ways of being a person and new religious forms where more and more you're supposed to govern yourself and be in control of yourself at all times. And that is what a good person is supposed to be, especially in the United States, where we have this particular history of Puritanism that turns into, I trace it to this figure I call my inner Yankee, this being that many of us have inside ourselves that we feel like we should be in control of ourselves at all time. And that is actually supposed to be the baseline of what all people are. The baseline is supposed to be we're in control of ourselves, not that we're dependent on other things. And then on top of that, for the United States, we have a very specific history of chattel slavery that connects to capitalism and connects to new religious forms. But some of our like deepest, most hurtful, painful national debates are about, are there people who shouldn't be in control of themselves, or can they be? And that everyone doesn't want to be a slave. And a slave comes to be the person who is enslaved to their dependencies. And then you have these huge debates over the course of the 19th, 20th century about things like social welfare and how we're supposed to take care of each other. And in the United States, even though we've had somewhat of a social welfare system, it's very much predicated on this idea that people are individuals that shouldn't be dependent on the state, on each other. They should be able to function on their own and not get swept away by things. And I mean, as you maybe can tell, I think this is a deeply harmful way of understanding how people are. But along with this kind of degradation or like disdain for dependency and forms of social welfare where we take care of each other, we also, this new thing started forming in the late 19th century called addiction. There was no word noun called an addict before the late 19th century. And as we get more and more anxious about being dependent on things, we start getting more and more anxious about our relationships to substances that feel good or take us away or help us function in the world, and we feel like we can't live without them. So at the same time that you get drugs as commodities for the first time, you also start getting all of these fears about people dependent or now addicted on these things. And I mean, I think the two of you probably know these stories as well, if not better than I. Then you get, the addiction industrial complex, basically, by the mid-century, where it's all about trying to understand this thing that is such a puzzle. How can there be people that aren't in control of themselves? And that, I think, what was so kind of radical about being with my neighbors in Mexico City. Their baseline assumption is people aren't in control of themselves. Like, you need each other. You're dependent on other people. You're dependent on God. You're dependent on, the household that you live in all kinds of ways. And so I think there is something really particular about our history of disdaining dependency in the United States that makes this question of addiction so fraught, and the way that we understand people's dependencies on substances so, again, impactful, but so damaging. I mean, it's where we get the drug war. And the drug war, I mean, so much is done in the name of our hatred of dependency, including, mass attempts at geopolitical domination on the names of protecting us from our dependencies. And it was incredibly interesting in Mexico to be among people that no one was fighting that war on their behalf because they're all for dependency. And it's an achievement to have as many dependencies as possible.
Thank you so much for all that history there. That's really good context. I appreciate you kind of reframing addiction as sort of, I wouldn't go so far as to say positive, but it's more neutral, right? We don't have to talk about it in these overwhelmingly negative, pessimistic terms. But I also wonder if there's sort of a risk there. Like, there's a huge debate over, quote, enabling. And, if you don't shame people for their addictions, then they're going to overwhelmingly give into them and then, either destroy themselves or others. And in your experience, that's not really what happens, right? So I think in an essay you wrote, with Vice, the problem wasn't dependency, it was isolation. So is that really just all we need? Is can we be addicted to heroin as long as we have enough friends and family?
Well, I mean, I think that's you get to a really great pointed question, and I'll answer it, but I would also love to hear what you two think in a way. I mean, so I can tell you what I experienced in Mexico City, but then I'd also like to think a little bit about my own family situation, but then also harm reduction, basically strategies or campaigns like they've done in Portugal or Switzerland, where they've just given people heroin and noticed that people can manage, if you have this kind of regular, reliable place where you get the thing you're dependent on, people end up having, fairly stable lives. And so I think that that's one of the things that we can think about as a model. I would say that also what you're asking me in some ways embeds a question that people have asked me a lot about safety and risk. Like if we let people or don't shame them or let them drink as much as they want or do as much heroin as they want, it's not only a problem for themselves potentially, right? Like it also could lead to people being more dangerous to others. And I think that is a really an important set of questions. And it's really important to kind of carefully parse what we're asking when we're asking that question. So in these neighborhoods in Mexico City, most folks live in a pretty, what I would call, different ecology than people live in the United States. We tend to live in much more solitary ways, alone or just maybe with one other person. And when you live in pretty dense, like extended family households, there's more people around to like buffer and absorb kind of what's going on with people when they are intoxicated or when they have any kind of issue that makes it so that they can't contribute. Like there's more people, but there's also more people to check in on each other. And if you're not doing that in the context of shame, it doesn't tend to spiral out where like someone's isolated and everyone else is together over here. So there's a family that I talk about a lot throughout the book. They were my landlady and landlords, Dolores and Clemente. And Clemente had a severe drinking problem, which she would call a vice. She called herself, Dolores called herself an alcoholic because her drinking was always social. And Vicente would take himself away. No one was isolating him. But when he was with people drinking, I never experienced him as abusive in the way that I experienced my own sister as abusive when she drank. And I think part of it is because I constantly tried to isolate my sister. So we started, this iterative process of hating on each other in all different kinds of ways. I was always trying to cast her out, and she was always trying to come back at me, but in anger and in rage. Whereas Clemente was all very kind of neutralized. Like there wasn't kind of you just brought up the word neutral. Like the fact that he went away was sad for people. And when he was with people drunk, which it wouldn't last that long because he wanted to be alone often, he wasn't in any kind of state because no one had been shaming him. And I saw this repeated over and over again. If you don't have anyone shaming you for being in dependency, a lot of those dynamics sort of fizzle or never emerge in the first place. I would also say that when I started being able to kind of apply some of that to my own life with my sister, with myself, with other people, and not kind of be like, what's wrong with you? How could you not be in control of yourself? How could you be doing this thing again? Things just really de-escalated internally in myself and especially with my sister. And it feels like another version of that harm reduction motto, meet people where they're at. I mean, it's sort of, and so much of the reason that the shaming and the kind of casting out happens, I think, is because we are so threatened in and of ourselves, because we don't like to see someone who seems out of control, because we're so scared of being out of control ourselves.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It can often be tough to differentiate between what is socially defined, like what we're defining as a culture, as a disorder, and what is actually destabilizing to a person in their life, or maybe unhelpful to them in their life. I was looking at the list of addictive disorders that exist in the DSM, and all of them except for one relate to substances. I think, the gambling was added later on, and that was actually it was quite different, because it was the first time that a behavior other than taking something into your body was listed as a disorder.
Yeah, it was a big moment.
Yeah, but so most of the discussion is related to substances, and you have several substances in there, like, coffee or caffeine, tobacco, and alcohol, that are not criminalized. And the rest of them, it's actually illegal to possess, sell, or take.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm wondering, because it seems like the unifying thread here when we're diagnosing these conditions is this person functioning socially?
Mm-hmm.
Even in the DSM, if you look at the criteria for meeting a substance use disorder, it's asking, is this person able to function socially? Because you have to meet multiple criteria. It's not just, did you do more than you expected,
Right.
or have you tried to stop?
Mm-hmm.
Do you persist despite negative consequences? If you take any one of those individual criteria, then the person doesn't meet the criteria, but you have to meet multiple criteria. And like when you tie those together, it's basically asking, okay, are you functioning in society?
Mm-hmm.
And when you mention the issues of isolation and how we start taking things away as soon as we find out that someone is maybe deviating from the standard norm of consumption or deviating from the standard norm of interaction, now we're going to start removing things. I'll remove myself from your life. I'll threaten to take your job. We'll take your children. And that somehow that's supposed to motivate someone to engage with those things less. But it seems like you're saying that has the opposite effect, because like the more isolated you become and the more you lose, the more reason you have to then go further away from the social stratosphere. And what I've always wondered about is when you have all these things that are criminalized, it seems like it's set up to isolate you and stigmatize you and basically make it impossible for you to function socially.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to create these conditions so that you can't function socially, and then we're going to say your lack of social functioning is a disorder.
Yep.
Like, how do we untangle this like circular mess that we're in? And then you throw criminalization into the mix, right? Which is like, okay, is alcohol, tobacco, and caffeine that much different from these other drugs that people get arrested for using or engaging with? And how do we interact differently with those? Like a friend that had a drinking problem, right? If it was a heroin problem, he might have wound up in jail, and that's a completely different conversation.
Yep.
Makes it tougher for family members to help you, or makes it tougher for you to gain access to different resources. Can you weigh in on this whole the structure that we have, this hierarchy of addictions, I guess you might call it? Like some are good. Okay, if I want to go running all the time
Yes.
as an American,
Yeah.
and
You're right.
my toenails are falling off, like, hey, it's fine. I can run till my knees blow out and no one's going to tell me to stop. I could work till I'm like, I could not see my kids for the next 25 years and spend all the time working, and no one is going to tell me to stop. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many things embedded in what you just asked, and I wish we had like 5 hours and we could just talk through each one of them, but we don't. So I think one of the things that you talk about when you talk about social functioning is that is really a different thing in different places. And so much of what social functioning is in the United States is working in a certain way and seeming independent. Like those are the two things that kind of count as, I mean, there's other things that count as social functioning. So if you're someone who seems dependent on substances or people when you're an adult, that is really suspect. And if you're not functioning in a way that allows you to work in a particular productive way, that also is, seen as a problem. And that's not what social functioning is for so many people in so many places. Like that, it's about, can you care for others, or can you be around? Can you participate in ways? And so I think that's one thing. And we all know, of course, like this has been said a million times, the drugs or the substances that promote certain kinds of productivity and capitalism tend not to be made illegal. So caffeine is an example of one. I mean, it doesn't work across the board completely, but it also works in the sense of like, ADHD meds, which are basically amphetamines, are fine in the context of you're giving them to people to become more productive, but they're not fine when people are using them to not be productive or to be recreational in some kind of way. And I And then, why alcohol is legal when it's the thing that we have the most evidence about as actually having harmful health effects in the short and the long term is really interesting. Like, why is that one not illegal when so many things that have way less of health effects have been made to be illegal? And I think we can parse that forever. But I think the other thing that you're getting at is the way that these categories, how substances are designated as legal or illegal, ends up really shaping the ecology of how people can use them. And then what the impact of them. So you pointed out one where, if you're arrested for engaging with or using a substance that's illegal, obviously that has impact. But another thing that's a little more, I don't know if it's up or downstream. I don't know. Just the fact that something is illegal shapes where you use it. And especially with something like opioids, the where you use opioids is a big deal, like because of what overdose means with opioids, stopping breathing. And if it means that you are ashamed, so you're doing them alone, or you're doing them alone because it's illegal, that actually leads, as what your t-shirts, that leads to death in all kinds of ways. And other substances also, using them alone can do all kinds of things. I mean, drinking alone and then driving, or, if you have more people around you, you're less likely to be impacted in the harmful way that kind of any powerful substance can create. So I think for me, the ecology of what's considered a socially successful person, where and when, is a big part of this. And then, what's considered deviant or not. And I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to push on in this book. But I think one of the really big things I'm trying to push on, even maybe more, is that our fear of dependency is part of what drives these decisions about what's acceptable, what's illegal. And, living alone for a lot of people, I mean, let's just not even talk about substances, although that's often a big part of it. A lot of mental health conditions are made really a lot worse by being alone. And, it is the ideal that you're going to live alone, or you're going to live with one partner, and maybe with kids, but that still can be quite isolating with people. And more people don't even have those forms of social safety net, social safety net, in the sense of being around people. And I think that push for independence is such a big part of what is producing harm in these ways. This, and then I guess I would also add to that our shame for when we can't be alone in the right way, or when we actually aren't in control of ourselves in relation to substances or behaviors, whether it's gambling or eating, anything like that.
Yeah, I can't count the amount of people I know that have lost loved ones to overdose, and they tell me, like, I didn't even know they were using. And I'll be like, well, I mean, I don't really say this to them sometimes, but of course they didn't tell you, and of course they died alone because shame and stigma. So I think there's a lot of things that we have to address in our society in terms of how our consumption can be unhealthy, right? Like, we shouldn't be eating ultra-processed foods or something like that. But, I mean, I shouldn't say should, but, like, it would be better if we were all,
Well, let's maybe just let's stop there for a second, because earlier on you said it doesn't have to be positive, but it could be neutral. And I think there is a way, I mean, I am kind of surfing in the book about the neutral and the positive in a way. I'm trying to move away from the negative towards the neutral, but also to the positive. And I think one of the things that's so hard when I talk about this with people is that we come from a place where, again, a sign of success is that you are a healthy individual and you take care of your health. And that is like the number one thing. That's how you're supposed to be responsible, because then that's going to make you a good family member, but actually, even maybe more importantly, it's going to make you a productive member of society. And there's a fair amount of places in the world where people's individual health isn't the number one thing they're going for. And in fact, in these neighborhoods, one of the biggest addictions was soda. And that might not sound like high stakes or high drama or gritty, but soda and the sequelae, the health effects of soda, are much more impactful in Mexico than any drugs or alcohol. Mexico has some of the highest diabetes and cardiovascular disease rates in the world. And it is also, Mexico is the highest consumer of soda and Coca-Cola products in the world. And people would tell, and there's public health campaigns everywhere telling people, don't drink soda, drink water, it's on you. And it's such a complex set of relationships that are happening when people do drink soda, because in the neighborhoods I lived in, everyone drinks soda. They never drank water. And this is ultra processed foods that are bad for you. But for them, the more important thing was doing things that enhance their collective health. And soda does that. It's delicious, more pleasurable than water. It's actually not much more expensive than water because of the way that actually the same government that's telling people not to drink soda is also subsidizing Coca-Cola. All of these things are happening. And in some ways, the neighborhoods that I was living in, people were defiant of these messages telling them, you should stop drinking soda for your individual health. It was like, no, we as a collective do this thing that enhances the pleasure of being together. And that is like, for us, the most important. I mean, Erin, you were talking about sociality, but it's like a form of health. It's like the pleasure in the health we're having now. And they'd say, like, I know I'm probably going to get sick. And the public health people I work with would say things like, what's wrong with them? Why aren't they being rational? And it's similar sets of conversations about soda that we have about heroin. I mean, and people would tell me I'm addicted. I cannot drink water. You can't eat meat without soda because greasy meat requires soda to cut it. Water just doesn't cut it in any way. I mean, if people drink a ton more soda than they drink beer, for instance, or tequila or anything like that. And I think this question of, we know that the right way to be is an individual who has control over themselves so they can be healthy and, be fiscally sound. Again, that is something that, I guess we've decided on, not very consciously, but it makes people who don't do those things completely deviant, makes them seem completely pathological. But I would say that using substances, whether it's Coca-Cola or fentanyl, or, we can think of a million different substances, or even gambling, because often gambling can be quite social. The way that people use substances to make them feel better when they are isolated, or they enjoy being alone and doing these substances, or when they're with groups, are forms of well-being that, don't count at all in this calculation that we make about what it is to be a good person.
Yeah, there's only certain ways that are acceptable, and it's this sort of arbitrary, because I've come to reframe my drug use, and I used a lot of drugs. I've used a lot of drugs in my life, and I've started identifying as a person who uses drugs instead of, like, I'm a person in long-term recovery, and my identity is framed on the fact that I don't do that anymore because I don't have a goal to never use drugs again. But I've had to reframe my own experiences because I had always thought for a good portion of my life that most of my drug use was a bad decision. But now that I'm a little older, looking back at the environment that I grew up in, and I grew up living on the streets. I was born and raised in a religious child sex trafficking cult, and I went through all this trauma growing up. So drug use saved my life, right? And I had to come to realize that. And it was rational. Like, the cost benefit of it, it was either like act out in whatever way I was going to act out, or have something to pursue and wake up every day and feel good about and do with other people and connect. You have to have a social. I think it's William Burroughs who said, like, heroin's not a kick, it's a lifestyle. I mean, you have to have people to use with, to get it from. And so like, there's a cost benefit process that's going on there. As you say, there are people who say, well, we know this is bad for us, but we prefer what we get from the social interaction, or we prefer what we get from on the other side of it. What kind of throws me sideways is this increasing medicalization, because it's like, we've come to kind of rely on science to answer the biggest problems and sort of understand nature. And I rely on science. I trust the scientific epistemology more than any other, just because I see it's reliable. It's given us a lot of answers throughout history. But there's been this increasing move to medicalize all of these things. And when I first came in, was sort of forced into this treatment milieu and structure of now you're going to get better. It was, addiction is a brain disease. When you put these substances in your body, it hijacks your brain and you lose control. And, you mentioned loss of control earlier, like how that's how people tend to frame it in Mexico and other countries as well, which is, this is something I can't control. But the medicalization of it has gone to the point of, okay, here's a brain scan and we're going to show you this is what's happening in the prefrontal cortex, and your brain is hijacked. And then I've read some books like comparing the brain of a person on drugs to someone who's in love, and they look completely identical. What do you make of like the disease framing of addiction? Is it something that's helpful to use as a metaphor for what's going on? Is it strictly true in some sense, or is it harmful? What do you think about it?
So one of the things that I do as a medical anthropologist is think long and hard and do a lot of research about how scientific questions are asked and answered. And I love science. Most of my best friends are scientists, but I think one of the things that happens when you look at the scientific process historically, you see that it's always changing what is considered right and true. There's been great stuff, but then things change, the questions change, and that the way questions are asked and the way we kind of define things is always based on whatever is up or whatever's going on in the time and the place where that set of questions was asked. And so the chronic relapsing brain model of disease, which has been kind of so hegemonic for the last few decades, it does seem like it's in the wane, like people are starting to kind of question that again. And if you look at the history of theories of addiction or definitions of addiction, it has just never settled for long in one place. Like there is not a single definition. And even when the brain definition was so predominant, especially, in NIDA and things like that, there's plenty of people, especially located more in psychology, that didn't go along with certain definitions of, addiction. There has never been a singular definition that is like preeminent and everyone agrees on, and then it's stuck around for a long period of time. So I think that's one thing to take into account. And then I think, again, as a medical anthropologist, we can look at what the disease model does. And that's I don't know if you've ever heard of Michel Foucault. Have you ever? He's a theorist, right? So one of the things that he taught us to do, not perfect by any measure, but a helpful guy in helping us notice that the way power works is often through science, but it's not like you immediately have to say, is this good or bad? It's like you could just look and say, what is this model or this way of treating something do in the world? And we can see with the disease model, it does certain things that can be useful. Like what it gets juxtaposed with all the time is this moral framing of addiction, which is there's something inherently wrong with the person. Like they don't have a right relationship with God, or they're just a bad person, and that's why they're drunk. Or that's what, and then we get the disease model and we're like, it's really about some malfunction in them. Like they have a genetic issue or they have a brain malfunction that we can measure somewhere with an MRI or something like that. So in some ways, it takes the blame off that person. And it can work to some degree. It's like, we can have treatment beds instead of prison beds. Like we can do that. But this other really wonderful theorist, an anthropologist, his name's William Roseberry. He was a historian and kind of a political anthropologist. He has this way of thinking about this that I think is really great. He calls it the language of contention. And it's a little bit in the book, I talk about it. And what he does is he shows, okay, so you have a debate, a contention. Is it bad people who are making bad choices? like, so we need more prisons? Or is it a disease? And that means we need more treatment. But either way, there's something wrong. Like it's a pathology or it's a moral failing. And we're not noticing when we do that we are inherently assuming that dependency is pathological. It's a problem we must solve. It is a riddle. Instead of asking, why are we so sure that dependency is a problem? We're instead debating why these people are dependent, even though all people are dependent. No matter how much we like to think we're independent, we are all dependent. So we might instead say, what are the dependencies that work for us? Like what dependencies do we want to cultivate? For some people, it might be massive devotion to God and being in a religious community. For some people, it might be alcohol, and there's some really interesting books about the history of alcohol being the history of sociality in these certain ways. Or for some people, in certain situations, like Native Americans, when they were given alcohol at these particularly, horrifying moments in US history, alcohol was really damaging. Although I think there's also debates about how at the same time alcohol provided forms of connectivity. But it's not like, how can we get rid of addiction then? I would say the question might be more, to what shall we be addicted? So it's not like we're trying to get away from addiction. We're trying to figure out, onto what shall we have dependencies? And that to me is a way out of this kind of language of contention of, why are people addicted? It either has to be this or this. Instead, if we framed it like, actually, most people are dependent, some we could call addicted. What are those addictions doing? And this really came up in the book when my sister, she stopped drinking and she kept, which was a major change. She was, I would call her a rageful drunk, but again, I think some of that was brought on by her isolation. But when she stops drinking, she still is taking a fair amount of medications to manage panic disorder and things like that. One of them is benzodiazepines, Klonopin. And the amount of people, some in recovery, not all people in recovery, but some, who shamed her for continuing to use a medication and being dependent on it was so striking. And as I did more work on this, it was like enraging. I mean, this is, you talk about making your life manageable. Here is this medication that made her life so manageable. And yet people were constantly trying to deprescribe it or take it away from her. And when I would have conversations with intake workers at various mental health facilities that she was potentially going to interact with, they were like, well, she can't be on Klonopin. And it was like, well, tell me, what is the problem with Klonopin? And they would say, and I mean, I just think it's so fun. She's dependent. And it was like, but what is the problem with dependency? What is the problem? And then sometimes they'd say things like, oh, Klonopin has associations with dementia. And it was like, but so do all the drugs that most doctors prescribe for things like high blood pressure. I mean, so why are we singling out a medication that has psychotropic effects that are very important for her and that allow her to be in the world, because that configuration stresses us out so much, because it changes her in particular ways. So that was a very long answer, I'm sorry, or a response. But I think instead of focusing so much on like, what is addiction? And we need to define it in a particular way. Is it a brain disease? Is it a metabolic disorder? It's sort of like, why are we so worked up about this as a thing in the world when most people have had some relationship to compulsion or are not in control of themselves throughout human history?
Absolutely, yeah, and that's sort of what I was getting at is like if we want to have a healthier society, which I think is admirable to a degree, without throwing the idea of dependency under the bus necessarily. Like it's not necessarily harmful or inherently destructive. It has its place. I think to kind of get to that point though, we have to really address the stigma first, and I just don't see that happening very soon, unfortunately. You're talking about, we went from prisons to like rehab beds, and that's like the key there is whether it's voluntary or not. And I think so much of what we're talking about are like people's dependencies and addictions are really just a response to how we've structured society. I really appreciate you bringing up the roots of this history, which is rooted in capitalism and like this rugged individualism where you have to be this person that's like is completely self-sufficient and never has an illness and never, indulges in something that might make them less productive, God forbid. Like I think that's all very important to be part of the conversation. And if we center that a little bit, maybe we'll actually start making some progress and we'll see less deaths and harm from addiction, that kind of thing. That's my hope anyway. And you're right. I think it's kind of important to stop having these conversations necessarily about what is addiction. Like,
yeah, but I just want to comment on something you just said, which is we can have these conversations to work on stigma. And I mean, that's what I did this book for. But part of the thing I'm talking about in the book and in all my teaching and work is that this is really about a set of structural issues. And one of the things that I felt was radical about my neighbors in Mexico City is they haven't been inculcated with this sense that it's up to them, that, they have to solve the world's problems through diet and exercise, through something like that. They're kind of like, that's on, they get it that Coca-Cola like owns the aquifer, and that's not on them. That would be about a set of policy positions and, us working to elect politicians that actually don't allow Coca-Cola to own the aquifer or makes Coca-Cola pay taxes. And when we think about things like the drug war or even recovery beds, I mean, this is all about money, right? Or the addiction recovery industry. And I mean, I do think it's both things where the more people can kind of question, like, why are we blowing up boats in Venezuela? Or, why are we doing this? And have more of a critical sense that we're not helping anyone. And addiction maybe isn't even the problem that matters here. What matters here is, the cost of housing, and which makes so many people homeless. And which makes you uncomfortable because then you see homeless people and they look like they're doing things I don't approve of. But really what you don't like is they're dirty. I mean, and well, what we really don't like is seeing anyone having potential pleasure or out of controlness in public. And it's such a problem. And it feels like it's been such a part of the backlash in decriminalizing efforts like in San Francisco and Vancouver is that, not only are they dirty, they're doing drugs. But there's a homeless, and there's a set of issues about real estate in this world. So I wanted to respond to what you were saying. I mean, I think we can't do the stigma without also just really thinking about these structural issues. And sometimes it's hard to feel hopeful, and sometimes you can feel kind of hopeful.
Yeah, it depends on the day of the week or something. Especially under this administration right now, I don't see a lot of progress being made on changing the stigma aspect of it. I mean, the Make America Healthy movement is very interesting to me. It's flawed in a lot of ways, but it does have some good points on certain things, which is actually why it's so insidious, I think, is because it actually does talk about truth. Like big pharma companies are profit-driven and can, corrupt it.
I mean, what I would say about MAHA is it's really responding to the way that medicine and science doesn't seem to really acknowledge people's lives in ways, but it doesn't have any structural critique. It, again, makes it completely up to people to make sure they're keeping out the toxins and they have the right green diet and all of this stuff that's going on where they seem like they're in a dance where they want actual structural change, but the Republicans will never let that happen. They will never regulate. It's fascinating to watch and painful.
Yeah, fascinating and painful. That's a good way of looking at it. Because there's a lot of good arguments to be made about making our food healthier and that kind of thing, but they're under the impression that if you just stop taking vaccines that we'll never have to go to a doctor again, which doesn't make any sense. And so, like, I don't know, how do you feel about, the way that RFK Jr. is kind of setting the tone on addiction right now?
It's depressing and terrifying. I feel like the two of you are probably a little bit more on the kind of front lines of harm reduction. For me, this book has been about writing something I know about and hopefully bringing it to the harm reduction table. But I haven't been on the front lines of that. And when I read about what RFK is proposing or what just got proposed in Utah, have you been following any of that? It's going to be it looks like it failed for now, but it's making these basically internment camps for homeless people where they're forced to undergo treatment. And what the treatment is for either mental health issues or addiction. These are terrible things. And the way that RFK talks about addiction is like he's channeling his inner Yankee. He basically, got through it in this like tough, cold turkey way, and that's what everybody should do. And he doesn't. I mean, I don't know. I'm laughing because it's just there's some ways that RFK is so preposterous as a human being that it's hard. But then at the same time, I also feel like there's so much media and social media portrayal of him by liberals discounting him because he was a heroin addict or because he used heroin. And I guess, if I got to rule the world, we'd be saying plenty of people have used heroin and still use heroin and have a lot of good things to contribute and say. That is not what discounts him. What discounts him is he actually doesn't know really anything about vaccines or how treatment works or how harm reduction works or what might be effective here. And so much of what he does is based on this very individualist idea in medicine of what's going to make people better. And he's kind of a direct descendant of these Puritans that are like, you shouldn't, you should control everything yourself, and there should be no social services or interest in what your experience of the world is or what kind of pleasures drugs bring. Like it's kind of strange because you would think, I mean, that's a common recovery story, I guess. Like everything that I did then was bad. And Aaron, I think you were kind of referring to that. But I think it's terrifying. Some days I feel like this is all going so badly, it will go down at the midterms. And then other times I feel like what's already been done is so devastating. It's going to take forever to come back in terms of like science funding, but also potentially in the kinds of things that happened in, I don't know, Portland, San Francisco around decriminalization. And I think that isn't only him. That's about billionaires who are funding campaigns to make it seem like addiction is the problem with those homeless people. Like the Fent Life campaign in San Francisco. Do you know about that at all?
Maybe unpack it just for listeners.
Yeah, the Fent Life campaign, and I'm getting a little bit of the details wrong, but there was some decriminalization, but at the same time, like a massive increase in homelessness because of real estate prices and speculation and, no regulation of how we do housing in this country, in one of the most expensive places in the country. And you have the deregulation, increased homelessness, and also a different kind of drug, fentanyl, which looks different, in the way that people take it and its impact on people. And then you get this massive backlash to decriminalization and these campaigns like Fent Life. They're all, we should go look up some of the images that were created. It's like, oh, your precious child is going to have to see someone on drugs. So that is what has happened with decriminalization. And, we need to stop this. We need to, have camping bans. We need, and part of the outcome is now we need to go put homeless people in Utah in internment camps. And I mean, these are like workhouses from, the 17th, 18th century. That's what's being proposed here. And, decriminalization, people say, well, it doesn't work, or people did more drugs. And it's like, you didn't do anything about homelessness. You didn't do anything about, the conditions that make it important to be able to have a substance that takes you away from the conditions of your life. So that's my rant. I have a feeling you have more to say.
I mean that's literal in Nazism. Like one of their first policies was to round up all the homeless so that they can make it seem like their social policies, their economic policies were working. And even Gavin Newsom, the California governor, is like in favor of some of these rounding up the homeless policies. And they're not addressing housing, they're not addressing access to healthcare, they're not addressing any of the other things. So it seems like all these policies from some neoliberal Democrats and also the Trump administration is just like going to push us into more isolation, which is gonna make the problem worse. So, yeah, I feel you in having different days of optimism and pessimism. But I think one thing that gives me hope is that at this moment in history, more people are aware than ever. It's harder to lie to people because we have social media and the internet and that kind of thing, and people can find their own information on this stuff. But I think people just can feel it too. They just know that the narrative about this stuff, about addiction, is just not reflective of reality anymore, and we need a different model or something, at least a different conversation.
Yeah. I've always wondered like what it'll take, because drugs and like, the criminalization aspect and everything has always been kind of a useful tool politically. If you have a group of people that you can marginalize and vilify, then you get everybody all riled up and angry at that group of people. And it's like, well, okay, I'm here to solve that problem. And isn't that how like the Nixon administration really launched the drug war to begin with? It was not really about drugs. It was more about controlling certain people in the country. But I like your perspective because you're starting from this point of, hey, I lived in this other country and they did things differently. And if our listeners take away nothing else, I would want them to realize, like, take a look around the world. Because for me, that was the most life-changing experience, was to see the differences in ways that people interact with addiction or addictive behaviors or substance use in different cultures. We just kind of assume everything's like this here, the way we've been conditioned and raised. And there are many different ways. And then when you see how different they are, you start to ask yourself, okay, is this a social thing or is it just the law of nature? And I've gleaned a lot of useful information discussing this with you and hearing you frame it in that context of how how differently a different culture and group of people could approach the problem and how that's helped you to shift your perspective. I really appreciate you bringing that to us. And also just in general, your own experiences and the ways that you've taken this from different angles, I think is going to be really helpful and edifying for our listeners. Thank you so much for your time with that.
I'm thrilled to get to be here to talk about it, especially with who I imagine your listeners are. I mean, I'm really hoping the book allows me to be helpful to harm reduction kinds of efforts in the world. And I also would just say that what you just said is basically, lots of things are being defunded, including critical social sciences like anthropology, which is the thing that allows us to denaturalize our own sense of this is how things have to be. This is the only way it can be in the world. And that's what anthropologists do. It's like, they do it differently over there. What could we take from that to think about how we could do that differently? And so it's thrilling to be here. And I hope people read the book, In Praise of Addiction. But also, I'm easy to find online if people want to talk to me about this.
Yeah, that was my next question is what's next for you and how can people find you online?
What's next for me is I in some ways, this book or addiction is not my day job. I spend a lot of time with environmental health scientists thinking about exposure, chemical exposure. And that's a whole other huge thing about why, there are so many harmful chemicals in the world and how do we manage that? And that has a lot to do with massive chemical corporations and capitalism as well. So I work on those kinds of issues. But I'm really, there's a lot more to the story in my family and with my sister and also these neighborhoods in Mexico that I hope I get to keep writing about. And I just hope that I can be helpful in these harm reduction conversations, because to me, they feel like the main place that is any kind of critical resistance to just this assumption that drugs are what we need to be fighting. And it's just not what we need to be fighting at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've thought about having discussing things other than drugs on this show in the future. We've talked a lot about drugs, But there's a lot there today. We had a great discussion, and I really appreciate your time today, Liz. And big shout out to you. Big shout out to our listeners who are hanging with us as we're trying to keep up with episodes. But we want to stay in the loop. So if you write anything else, let us know. If you have anything else you'd like to chat about.
And if you have follow-up questions or thoughts about how this could be useful in any realm of both of your lives, let me know. Seriously.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'm so glad I got to do it. And this has been a great conversation.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Narco Media, co-hosted and co-produced by Troy Farah and Aaron Ferguson. I'm your co-producer, Aaron Ferguson. If you like the show, you can find out more at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Narcotica. If you're a patron, you also get free stickers which are personally mailed to you. You can also request a shout out on the show. And now patrons can even get 30% off of merch in our new store, which is at narcocast.myshopify.com. We have t-shirts and coffee mugs, one that says "There are drugs in here," which is awesome. More stuff will be added soon. As always, we are so grateful to the folks that make this show possible. A little goes a long way, so thanks for making Narcotica happen. We're ad-free and we want to keep it that way. If Patreon just isn't for you, that's fine. You can help us out by spreading the word. Tell all your friends about the podcast, advocating for social justice and abolishing the drug war. You can also rate us wherever you get your podcasts. Our theme music is by Glassboy, and Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica. Additional music is by myself, alias Nomad1, drug-using producer. Well, I guess that's all. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Until next time.